Malia Obama stared at the neatly folded map on her passenger seat, a token of nostalgia she had insisted on bringing despite the GPS on her phone. This wasn't just a road trip. It was a declaration of freedom. After grueling years of academic rigor, she had earned this moment. A journey to celebrate not only her graduation but her resilience. Her destination was Birmingham, Alabama, a city steeped in history and connection. But this trip wasn't about history. It was about her. The open road was her chance to breathe, think, and simply be. As the morning sun crept higher into the sky, Malia set off from her Washington, D.C. apartment. The playlist she'd curated hummed softly in the background. The car felt like her cocoon, carrying her through rolling fields and quiet highways. She wanted to take her time, stopping wherever the mood struck her, savoring the solitude. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, just past the sprawling greens of the Cumberland Plateau, she pulled into a small roadside diner for a quick lunch. The place was charming in its simplicity. Checkered tablecloths, the faint smell of fresh coffee, and a friendly server who smiled as she jotted down Malia's order. It felt good to be anonymous, just another traveler passing through. Back on the road, her thoughts drifted to the significance of this trip. She wasn't just celebrating her graduation. She was carving out space to reflect on who she was and what came next. The freedom of the road stretched before her, and she embraced it fully. But by the time she reached the outskirts of a tiny Alabama town, the landscape began to shift. The familiarity of well-traveled highways gave way to quieter, less maintained roads. The occasional truck rumbled by, but otherwise the world seemed still. She glanced at her fuel gauge and realized she'd need to stop soon. Spying a small gas station ahead, she turned in. It was the kind of station that time seemed to forget. Weathered signs, a single pump, and a lone clerk reading a newspaper behind the counter. Malia filled up her tank, feeling the heaviness of the quiet around her. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lot, and for the first time on her trip, she felt a slight edge creeping into her thoughts. As she finished pumping gas, a patrol car rolled into the lot. Malia noticed the officer glance her way, his expression unreadable. She offered a polite nod and turned back to her car, brushing off the faint prickle of discomfort. She reminded herself that she had done nothing wrong and had every right to be here, just like anyone else. Sliding back into the driver's seat, she pulled onto the main road, eager to put the stop behind her. She didn't know it yet, but her journey was about to take a sharp and unexpected turn. The last rays of sunlight had dipped below the horizon when Malia saw flashing blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. Her chest tightened. She knew the routine. Pull over, stay calm, comply. But something about this felt off. She slowed her car to the shoulder, her mind racing. What could they want? She wasn't speeding. Her registration was current, and she hadn't broken any laws. The officer approached her window briskly, his flashlight sweeping across her interior before settling on her face. "License and registration," he said curtly. His tone wasn't one of mere procedure. It carried a sharpness that immediately put her on edge. Malia handed over her documents, her hands steady but her voice cautious. "Is there a problem, officer?" The man studied her license intently, his eyes narrowing at the name. "Obama," he said slowly, as if tasting the word for the first time. "As in the Obamas?" She nodded slightly, unsure of how to respond. The officer's lips curled into a smirk. "You're driving a pretty nice car for these parts," he remarked, his voice thick with insinuation. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" "To Birmingham," Malia replied, keeping her tone even. "I'm on a road trip." The officer straightened, his expression hardening. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Malia's heart thudded painfully in her chest. "Why?" she asked, her voice firm but not confrontational. She needed to understand what was happening. "Don't make me repeat myself," he snapped. "Step out of the car." Her instincts screamed at her to comply, so she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. The cool night air bit at her skin as she stood on the shoulder, the patrol car's headlights casting long, harsh shadows. Within moments, another patrol car pulled up, and a second officer joined the scene. He was taller, more imposing, and immediately exuded authority. Without so much as a greeting, he circled her car, shining his flashlight into every crevice. "This vehicle matches the description of a stolen car," the first officer declared, his words clipped and mechanical. "We need to conduct a search." "That's not true," Malia said, her voice rising slightly. "This car is mine. My name is on the registration." The second officer ignored her, opening the car door and beginning to rifle through her belongings. Malia clenched her fists at her sides, her frustration bubbling over. She wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but the weight of the situation kept her in check. When her phone buzzed in her pocket, she instinctively reached for it, only to hear a sharp command. "Hands where I can see them," the second officer barked, his hand hovering near his holster. Malia froze, her pulse pounding in her ears. "I was just—" she began, but her voice faltered. The officer's gaze pinned her down, cold and unyielding. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they searched her car, their handling of her belongings careless and disrespectful. Finally, the second officer emerged empty-handed. "Everything checks out," he muttered begrudgingly. The first officer handed her documents back without so much as an apology. "You're free to go," he said, his tone dismissive. Malia stared at them, her anger finally spilling over. "Why was I stopped in the first place?" she demanded. The officers exchanged a glance before the first one replied, "You match the description of a stolen vehicle." His vague excuse did nothing to satisfy her. Humiliated, furious, and shaken, Malia got back into her car. As she drove away, the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving her with a deep, simmering anger. She replayed the encounter in her mind, each detail cutting deeper than the last. When she finally reached Birmingham hours later, her body felt heavy with exhaustion. But more than that, she felt a fire igniting within her, one that wouldn't let her remain silent. The door to her hotel room clicked shut, and for the first time since the incident, Malia exhaled deeply. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her mind racing with fragments of what had happened. Flashing lights, harsh commands, and the weight of the officer's words lingering in her ears. Her body felt drained, but her thoughts were relentless, looping the encounter like a cruel replay. She reached for her phone and dialed her mother. It didn't matter how late it was. She needed to hear Michelle's voice. The phone rang only twice before her mother's familiar tone came through, calm but concerned. "Malia, what's wrong?" Michelle's intuition was sharp, her worry evident even without details. Malia's voice cracked as she began recounting the events. She tried to keep her tone steady, but as the words spilled out, her anger and frustration broke through. "They treated me like I was a criminal, Mom. They didn't believe who I was. They didn't care. They just saw me and assumed the worst." Michelle listened silently, allowing Malia the space to vent. When her daughter finished, there was a long pause before Michelle finally spoke. "Malia, what happened to you is something your father and I have faced more times than I can count. This isn't new, but it never gets easier." Barack's voice chimed in. He had been listening on speakerphone. "It's not fair, Malia, but the question now is, what do you want to do about it? You can let it break you, or you can use it to build something stronger." Malia's emotions wavered between frustration and helplessness. "But what can I even do?" It's not like this is the first time something like this has happened to someone. What difference does it make? Michelle's tone shifted, gentle but resolute. It makes all the difference when you decide to speak out. Your voice is powerful, Malia. You've seen what silence allows to continue. This is your chance to do something. Not just for yourself, but for every person who's been through this. Her father added, "You've been given a platform, whether you like it or not. Use it. Speak the truth, and don't let fear stop you." Malia sat quietly, her parents' words sinking in. The fire that had sparked earlier in the night began to grow. They were right. She had a voice and she had the means to use it. This wasn't just about her. It was about every unjustified stop, every assumption, every indignity faced by others who couldn't speak up. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through her hotel window, Malia made her decision. She wasn't going to let this moment fade into silence. She called a civil rights attorney, recounting every detail of her encounter. The attorney listened attentively and assured her that her case was significant, part of a much larger pattern that needed addressing. Later that day, Malia sat down with her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The words came slowly at first, but soon her thoughts flowed freely. She wrote about the stop, the humiliation, and the anger, but more importantly, she wrote about the need for change. She poured her heart into an op-ed that wasn't just her story. It was a call to action. Malia's op-ed was published in a major national newspaper under the headline, "This is why we can't stay silent." In it, she detailed her harrowing encounter on that dark Alabama road and connected it to the larger issue of systemic bias in law enforcement. The piece wasn't just a recounting of events. It was a plea for accountability and change. Her words struck a chord, resonating with readers from all walks of life. The response was overwhelming. Messages flooded her inbox. Stories from people who had experienced similar treatment, words of encouragement, and even criticism. But Malia didn't back down. She knew the power of the narrative she had unleashed. The op-ed had lit a fire, and now she had to fan its flames. A week later, she stood in front of a packed room at a press conference organized by a prominent civil rights organization. Cameras flashed, and the murmur of reporters filled the air. Malia adjusted the microphone, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she looked out at the crowd, her nerves melted into resolve. "This isn't just about me," she began, her voice steady and strong. "This is about a system that sees people like me as suspicious simply for existing. It's about the countless individuals who face this kind of treatment daily but don't have the platform to speak out. I'm here because this stops now." Her words rippled through the room, striking a balance between vulnerability and strength. She shared her experience in detail, her voice never wavering. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. But Malia's mind was already on what came next. Over the following weeks, Malia threw herself into the fight. She collaborated with civil rights groups, meeting with lawmakers to advocate for federal legislation addressing racial profiling. She appeared on talk shows, where she spoke candidly about her experience and the broader implications of prejudice in law enforcement. Her face became a symbol of the movement, but Malia remained focused on the cause. One of her most significant moments came during a meeting with Senator Carla Torres, a longtime advocate for criminal justice reform. Together, they drafted a proposal for a federal anti-profiling bill. The bill outlined mandatory training programs for law enforcement, strict accountability measures for misconduct, and a national database to track incidents of racial profiling. In every interview, Malia's message was clear. This isn't about blame. It's about fixing what's broken. We can't ignore these issues anymore. We owe it to the next generation to do better. Her advocacy inspired others to step forward, sharing their stories and joining the movement. A viral hashtag emerged, amplifying voices across the nation. People from all corners of the country rallied behind her, calling for tangible change. But not everyone supported her efforts. Critics accused her of using her family's name for personal gain or claimed she was exaggerating the incident. Malia faced the backlash head-on, addressing it with composure. "This isn't about me," she reiterated. "It's about all of us." Through it all, Michelle Obama was by her side, offering guidance and encouragement during late-night phone calls. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Every movement starts with a voice willing to say enough." Malia carried that sentiment with her, using her platform to amplify not just her own story but those of countless others. Months passed, and the ripples of Malia's advocacy continued to spread. The proposed federal anti-profiling bill gained momentum, with lawmakers from both sides of the aisle debating its merits. The media followed every development, and Malia remained at the forefront, attending hearings and giving testimony about her experience. The Alabama Police Department involved in her case issued a formal apology and announced sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training and increased oversight. The 2 officers who had pulled her over were suspended, and the department faced pressure from activists to ensure long-term accountability. For Malia, the most meaningful impact wasn't in the headlines or the legislative chambers. It was in the stories she heard from others. At rallies and town halls, people approached her with gratitude, sharing how her bravery had inspired them to confront their own fears and speak up. Parents told her they were teaching their children about their rights, emboldened by her example. One evening, as she prepared to speak at a college campus event, her phone rang. It was her father. "I just wanted to tell you how proud I am," Barack said, his voice warm and steady. "You've turned something painful into something powerful." "That's not easy, Malia." She smiled, her eyes misting. "I'm just doing what you and Mom always taught me, to stand up for what's right." The event that night was electric. Students filled the auditorium, many wearing shirts emblazoned with slogans from the movement. As Malia took the stage, she felt a deep sense of purpose. "When I was stopped on that road in Alabama, I felt small," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "But now I realize that moment wasn't about shrinking. It was about growing. It was about finding the strength to stand tall, not just for myself, but for everyone who's been made to feel less than. Together, we can demand a better, fairer world." The crowd erupted in applause, and Malia felt the weight of their support. It wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a collective mission to challenge injustice and push for progress. As the weeks turned into months, Malia's efforts bore fruit. The anti-profiling bill passed through Congress, marking a significant step toward accountability in law enforcement. While it wasn't a cure-all, it was a start, a tangible result of voices refusing to be silenced. In quieter moments, Malia reflected on how far she had come since that night on the Alabama road. What had started as an experience of humiliation and fear had transformed into a journey of empowerment and change. She wasn't naive. She knew the fight was far from over, but she also knew the power of taking a stand, of using her voice to ignite conversations that mattered. Michelle often reminded her, "Courage doesn't mean you're unafraid. It means you act even when fear is there." Those words became her mantra as she continued to push for justice, her resolve unshaken. Malia's story became more than just a headline. It became a symbol of resilience, advocacy, and the power of speaking truth to power. And in the years to come, as the world continued to grapple with systemic inequities, her voice remained a beacon for those striving to create a future rooted in equality and respect.